Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be looking at the Supreme Court ruling that led to 70,000 forced sterilizations, Buck versus Bell, by Mr. Beat. I will, as always, put a link to the original content in the description below. I highly encourage you to head over to Mr. Beat's channel and show him support if you like what you see here. We want to encourage him to keep making all his wonderful videos on the presidents and Supreme Court cases especially. He covers a lot of primarily U.S. history, but those are his kind of primary areas of focus on his content. I've seen quite a few of his more recent stuff, and I love what he does. So let's show him some love. Anyway, enough about that. We're going to go ahead and get into this. Before we do, I just want to say that we're talking about a period of history, especially U.S. history, but even global history, the eugenics movement. It starts in, I believe it's 1893 or 1883. I just remember it ended in a 3. The last decade or so of the 19th century in any case. And that's when it really kind of conceptualizes and the term eugenics is created. And then it spreads and grows rapidly, especially in the United States. I'm not sure how many U.S. citizens really understand how far we were headed down the path of eugenics, especially in the 1920s and early 1930s. When you look at, like, for example, the Nuremberg trials and the interviews with the doctors that were responsible for all the German eugenics programs during the Second World War and the lead up to that, they straight out say they were directly inspired by the United States policies and procedures that were in place in the 20s for eugenics, including the Supreme Court ruling we'll be talking about today, Buck versus Bell. We were on a pretty dark path, or at least in my opinion, a pretty dark path heading into World War II. We had massive eugenics programs, and they were growing. A significant number of states had sterilization laws as a result of Buck versus Bell. This is originally limited to a handful of states. It gets tested in court. The Supreme Court says it's okay. You can forcibly sterilize people, and it takes off. And it wasn't, in this particular case, Buck versus Bell, it's got to do with people who are mentally handicapped, primarily. However, the eugenics movement went way beyond that. There were studies, questionable studies, that link behavior to, and behavioral traits, and we put it that way, to genetics. It's the old nature versus nurture debate. Are people born bad, or are they born good? Or do they become bad and become good based on how they're raised, the circumstances they live through, the environment they grow up in, that kind of thing? And there's some arguments to be made on all sides, but with the eugenics movement, it was pure genetics. Whether you're going to be rich or poor, genetics. Whether you're going to be well-behaved or badly behaved, genetics. So there were a lot of programs where they were trying to selectively breed. You had to have the right ancestry. They were creating a database of genealogy so they could determine who was fit to breed and who wasn't based on their ancestry. I mean, it was getting pretty dark in some places. And then there was a racial eugenics where certain races are worth perpetuating, other races should be forcibly sterilized. I don't think I need to tell you how dark that can get. I mean, and not even just races, but just ethnic groups, the Jews, for example, as well as, African Americans. Or it even went to the extreme where it wasn't even just some of the more obvious groups, but groups like, we only want people from certain groups breeding, specifically the far western European nations and the northern European nations. So your Anglo-Saxons, your Scandinavians, that's about it. You don't want to have any of those Eastern Europeans in there or Southern Europeans in there. That dilutes the purity. In fact, the eugenics movement is a big part of why we get our first serious national immigration law in the 1920s, which restricts immigration to only primarily to only certain countries, namely the ones that we want our people breeding with. It gets dark. It gets really dark. And this case opens the door to forced sterilizations and without consent. That's what forced means. Some people were sterilized and didn't even know that they were sterilized. So when we say 70,000 were forced, I would imagine it's probably more than that. That's just the ones we know about. I doubt they went out of their way to keep accurate records on some of these forced sterilizations. Anyway, enough about that. I don't know what all Mr. Beat's covering, but since it's a fairly short video, I don't think he's going to go deep into the overall eugenics movement. So I wanted to get that out of the way first. This is taking place in a period of time when the United States is seriously going down the path of eugenics. And like I said, the Germans of World War II, gotta watch what you say on YouTube because it can cause problems. The Germans of World War II looked to us here in the States for inspiration on all their eugenics stuff. And that is not a good thing. When the Nuremberg trials come along and they say we were inspired by the Americans, that's not a good look for us. And some of our prominent people were part of this too. The Rockefellers and the Carnegies helped fund some of the eugenics movement, early movement. Henry Ford was a part of it. Alexander Graham Bell was a part of it. Yeah, terrible times. Let's see what Mr. B has to say. He's usually very thorough, but he'll be talking about one specific case that I think will kind of be a good look at a specific part of a very much larger problem in the United States at this time.
Mr. Beat presents Supreme Court Brief.
Not that
Madison
kind of brief.
Heights, Virginia, September 10th, 1924. Eugenics Dr. Albert Sidney Priddy, the dude in charge of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, requests to sterilize 18-year-old patient Carrie Buck. According to Dr. Priddy, Buck had the mental age of a 9-year-old and argued that if she was allowed to have children, this would be dangerous for society. Okay,
I'm going to stop this right here, and I'm sure Mr. Beat will probably get into it at some point. There's actually very little evidence that Carrie Buck was as just described here. In fact, later in life, people who knew her said she was more or less of average intelligence and ability. So I just want to get that out of the way up front, because that's kind of relevant to this discussion.
Oh, just so we are clear here, he wanted to force her to go through a procedure so that she could never have kids because of her genetics. Wait, hold up. Let's go back a bit because this story is even more messed up than this. So, Carrie Buck was the daughter of Emma Buck, who previously was taken away by the state from Carrie and her siblings when Carrie was a kid. Virginia confined Emma to, you guessed it, the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded for prostitution, immorality, and having syphilis. So, Carrie grew up with foster parents who treated her like a slave. How did Carrie also end up at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded? Her foster parents sent her there for hopelessly bad behavior, sleeping around, and, quote, feeble-mindedness. I'm not joking. Also, they sent her there apparently as a result of...
I find it interesting that he put it in quotes, feeble-mindedness, because like I said earlier, people who knew her later in life said that that doesn't appear to have actually been the case. What she apparently was promiscuous, although there's some little question on that too. I hope we get to.
Of being raped by her foster mother's nephew. Again, I am not joking.
Yeah, she's promiscuous because somebody raped her. Yeah.
Since Carrie Buck was declared mentally incompetent to raise her child, her now former foster parents ended up adopting the baby. At 7 months old, that baby, whose name was Vivian, would also be declared, quote, feeble-minded. So anyway, back to Dr.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sure I was pretty feeble-minded at the age of 7 months too. Just saying.
Dr. Priddy trying to sterilize Carrie. He first wanted to make sure it was legal. I mean, the state had passed a law called the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924, which allowed doctors to forcibly sterilize patients who supposedly had genetic traits that would be damaging to society if passed on to the next generation. However, the law had yet to be tested in the courts. So the board of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, got it to happen. After ordering Buck sterilized, the board appointed her a random dude named Robert Shelton to be her guardian. He was the guardian of several of the institution's patients and got paid for doing it, by the way. Buck's lawyer was a dude named Irving Whitehead, who was a eugenics fan who wanted the sterilization law. Oh, and apparently he was also on the board, helping.
Yeah, so I think everything stacked against Buck right from the beginning.
Request Buck's sterilization. In fact, he was good friends with Albert Priddy and Aubrey Strode, who represented Priddy in court. There's no conflict of interest there. Whitehead made no effort to challenge the accusations that Buck was feeble-minded, of course. Shelton appealed the sterilization to the Circuit Court of Amherst County, who agreed the sterilization should take place. Shelton appealed again to the Supreme Court of Virginia, who also agreed it should take place. So one more appeal to the Supreme Court, who heard oral arguments on April 22nd, 1927. By this time, Priddy had died, and his successor, Dr. John Bell, now represented the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. Buck's defense argued that she had the right to have kids because it was her right to due process of the law, and that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment also protected that right. The court didn't take too long for this one. On May 2nd, 1927, it announced its decision. It sided with Bell, saying the Virginia Sterilization Act was constitutional. It was 8-1. The lone dissenter was Justice Pierce Butler, who did not write an opinion, but him being a devout Catholic may have played a role. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion, saying, yes, Buck, as well as her mother and daughter, were indeed, quote, feeble-minded and, quote, promiscuous, and it was in Virginia's interest to get her sterilized. So basically, public welfare was more important than the welfare of one person's body, a classic greater good argument, comparing sterilization to forced vaccinations. In fact, Holmes referenced the case Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a 1904 Supreme Court decision which upheld a Massachusetts law forcing kids going to school to get the smallpox vaccine. He wrote, quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind."
Okay, I don't even know where to start with this. I just really don't. For starters, promiscuity being linked to feeble-mindedness and I guess, probability that they're going to somehow be criminal, right there is kind of a non-starter argument. The idea that we should prevent these people from breeding because, again, there's one of the driving ideas of the eugenics movement early on is that your behavior is inheritable, that you inherit from your parent their behavioral patterns. So if your mother is promiscuous, you're going to be promiscuous. If your mother is feeble-minded, you're going to be feeble-minded. If your mother is a criminal, you're going to be a criminal because it's genetics. It opens up the door to other issues. For example, nowadays we can use genetics to tell if somebody's going to be born, potentially anyway, be born with some kind of a problem or abnormality. You see what I'm saying here? Where do you draw the lines on this? Where do you say preventing these people from being able to have children or potentially prevent these children from being born if somehow they do get pregnant? Where do we draw the lines and what criteria do we use? Because it's so slippery slope. Like I said, we get into points where it's like there were advocates for forced sterilization of all African Americans because they were diluting the gene pool. That was a part of the eugenics movement. They were arguing for that. Anyway, I just really don't know where to go with this. This is just, it's just...
unquote. Holmes now infamously concluded by writing that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, unquote. Wow, Wendell, just...
Yeah, and they're judging a 7-month-old child as an imbecile. I think we're all imbeciles at the age of 7 months. Okay, well, maybe not you, but everybody else was.
Wow, buddy. Buck v. Bell further legitimized eugenics laws throughout the United States, and several states added sterilization laws afterward. In fact, 30 states had some sort of sterilization law, and ultimately around 65,000 Americans were forced to be sterilized, most of them from poor or working class backgrounds, and many sterilized without even knowing it. At the Nuremberg trials after World War II, Nazi doctors specifically cited Holmes' opinion in the decision to defend themselves. It certainly remains one of the most hated Supreme Court decisions
as it should be. And as far as I know, it's still on the books.
Ever. Buck v. Bell was never overturned. Believe it or not, it still stands, although it was later weakened by the Supreme Court case Skinner v. Oklahoma. Fast forward 75 years, and Virginia Governor Mark Warner apologized for his state's participation in eugenics, and later some called for reparations to all the sterilization victims. So whatever happened to Carrie Buck? Well, on October 19th, 1927, a few months after the Supreme Court decision, Dr. John Bell personally performed the operation that prevented her from ever having children again. She was the very first person in Virginia sterilized under the new law. In order to make sure the entire family couldn't reproduce, Carrie's sister, Doris, was also later sterilized after she was hospitalized for appendicitis. Yeah, she was never told about the sterilization. Doris and her husband.
Yeah, now imagine that. Imagine living in a time when people could decide whether or not you could have kids for you and force a decision on you whether you want it or not, and not even let you know about it.
Been attempted for years to have children. Only in 1980 did she find out why they were unsuccessful. Carrie's supposedly feeble-minded daughter, Vivian, later did well in school, even making the honor roll. However, she unfortunately died from an infection when she was 8 years old. As it turns out, there was no evidence whatsoever that Carrie Buck was, quote, feeble-minded. Most accounts later describe her as having average intelligence. People who knew her recalled how nice she was to everyone and how much she enjoyed reading books. She lived a long life. She died in 1983 and was buried in Charlottesville near her only child, Vivian.
I just have no words for some of the stuff that they did and wanted to do. And we're kind of fortunate they weren't able to do all they wanted to do. And they're still around. There's still eugenicists around. But yeah, in some ways we're kind of fortunate that Germany grabbed the ball from us and ran with it, because I think that helped make Americans and the rest of the world more aware of how eugenics can go horribly wrong, by an obvious example of World War II era Germany and just how out of control and how horrible it can get. I think that was kind of a wake-up call for the world, and especially for the United States. Anyway, enough about that. I'm just going to get depressed if I keep talking. And this is a topic I really just don't have words for most of the time, because it's about as dark as it gets. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye-bye.